Where the German soldier stands, nothing can shake him, Hitler used to tell us. But in the winter of 1941-42 this statement had already been disproved, and now, here in Stalingrad, we were fed up with empty blown phrases, empty trash talk. The German Reich should have stood for 1,000 years, but it faltered after only 10. On January 30th, from the very morning, the Russians nailed us with all barrels and from different distances. They were hitting us from all guns and also from the demoralizing Stalin organs. One could hardly find a gap between salvos to poke one's nose outside and see what was going on around. The bombardment had completely melted the snow around our shelter, and brown mud thickly carpeted everything around us. We were sitting in the basement of a destroyed building. The concrete roof and a safely dug-out dugout nearby protected us perfectly from artillery fire. We were not far from the building of the department store, in the basement of which sat Paulus and his headquarters. There was also the command post of our 71st Infantry Division. What the generals were thinking and doing in that cellar I did not know. Probably they did nothing. Just waited, because Hitler forbade surrender, and to continue resistance by this hour was becoming increasingly futile. It was clear to everyone that tomorrow, January 31st, would be the last day of freedom in the encirclement. So I distributed all the remaining food to the soldiers and told them that there would be nothing more. Everyone could do with his share what he thought was right. We turned on the radio and heard Göring's speech on the 10th anniversary of the National Socialists taking power. It was still the same exaggerated theatrical puffing of cheeks with pompous phrases that had not seemed so vulgar to us before. We took this speech as a mockery of those who were dying in Stalingrad because of the wrong decisions of the High Command. Stalingrad was turned into a myth even before the heroes died safely. Somebody yelled, "Turn it off! That asshole left us to die, and he's going to spout cardboard phrases and fill his belly. He can't do anything himself, you fat, pompous parrot." In rage, many more swear words were uttered, some even against Hitler. We didn't want to listen to eulogies against ourselves. Göring's promise to supply the cauldron by air led to the refusal of the breakthrough. And now the entire army was sacrificed because of his stupid ignorance. January 31st was a Sunday. I was awakened by a shout. "The Russians!" Still half asleep, I ran down the steps to the top with pistol in hand, shouting, "He who shoots first will live longer!" I ran to the embrasures, where several of my artillerymen were already standing and firing. I grabbed my rifle and went to the side window. The Russians were running through our positions, and I opened fire on them. And from our dugouts soldiers began to run out with their hands up. An old non-commissioned officer was aimlessly firing his pistol into the air to stop them, but a short burst from a Soviet machine gun finished him off. The gun positions were lost. My artillerymen were taken prisoner. The bathhouse I was sitting in as a fortress would hold out a little longer. The battery on our left was captured. The battery commander with a few soldiers made their way to our bathhouse. We fired continuously. Some gunners made notches on their rifle butts for each Russian killed. What were they thinking? Or was it to flatter their egos, remembering their long-ago victories? Why all this? It didn't make a dime's worth of sense. For a moment, out of respect for our repulse, the Russians pulled back. One of our machine guns malfunctioned in the cold. The oil froze and we artillerymen didn't know what to do about it. The rifle remained the most reliable weapon. I fired it at anything that could be considered a target, but did not hit as often as I had hoped. There was plenty of ammunition. Open ammunition boxes were almost everywhere. On our right, where the infantry were, no more firing could be heard. There were waving pieces of white cloth tied to sticks and rifles. They came out one by one and the Russians formed columns of them and led them away. It was quiet outside. Then some Russian tanks came up and started firing on the bathhouse. The thick walls held so far, but how much longer would they hold out? The T-34s came closer and were now firing machine guns directly at the embrasures. It was the end. Whoever approached the loophole was instantly killed by a bullet to the head. In all this confusion, Russian parliamentarians suddenly appeared outside the building. Before us stood a lieutenant, a bugler, and a soldier with a small white flag on a pole. The soldiers had had enough of war. They put down their rifles and looked for their packs. And I and two others ducked out of the bathhouse and disappeared among the ruins. After running away, we looked back at the bathhouse. The fight was over there. The defenders were coming out in a chain through the Russian cordon. No one went to Valhalla just before the finale. And we, perturbingly, would have been better off staying with the others because, despite the heavy losses, there was no sign of Russian brutality. We made our way cautiously through the piles of garbage into the center of town. The time was getting towards evening, and we did not yet know that at this time Field Marshal Paulus had already boarded the car that would take him to captivity. Cauldron, in the center of Stalingrad, ceased to exist. In the northern Cauldron, the slaughter continued for 2 more days under the command of General Strecker. Running from house to house and crawling through cellars, we 3 fugitives came across 2 Russians with machine guns. I dropped my gun and raised my hands. When my white camouflage jacket was unzipped, the officer's buttonholes on the collar became visible. A short curse was followed by a punch to the face. They corralled us back into a corner, and several Russians pointed automatic rifles at us. "Well, that's it, they won't take singles prisoner." I felt no emotion, waiting indifferently as the great unknown approached us. I did not know what to expect. The question whether the Russians would shoot us or not remained unanswered. A passing T-34 stopped and distracted the soldiers. They talked. A junior lieutenant covered in oil got out of the turret and searched us once again. He found my Leica, but not knowing what to do with it, he threw it against a brick wall. The lens shattered. I felt sorry for my photos. They were all taken for nothing. Our watches were taken from us from the start. Despite my protests, the junior lieutenant took my leather coat. He wasn't interested in my leather tablet, nor my paper and watercolors. He liked my warm leather gloves and, smiling, took them off me. Climbing into the tank, he threw me a pair of oil-stained fur mittens and a sack of Russian dried bread. About 20 prisoners were walking past us. We were pushed into this group and now we were heading west. We were prisoners and felt nothing bad about it. The dangerous phase of the transition from free soldier to disenfranchised prisoner, including our dangerous escape, was over. Although the sun was shining from a clear sky, the temperature was extremely low. The will to live returned to my body. I resolved to do whatever I could to get through what lay ahead of me. To get through and come back. The fighting in Stalingrad ended for us on January 31, 1943. Now, as a group of almost 30 prisoners, we were walking westward along a narrow path. I expected that we would be loaded onto a transport and taken to the camp, but no, we walked. The first thing was breadcrumbs, which I shared with 2 comrades. It was important, because soon there would be nothing more to share. Hunger would lead to selfishness and drive out humanity. There will be little left of camaraderie and brotherly love. And the fact that I had been robbed so horribly was no longer a tragedy for me. I even felt some gratitude to that smiling tank commander who paid for my coat and gloves with bread. Bread was more valuable than a rather useless leather coat or camera. And the oiled fur mittens from the same commander, I will still need them. No Russian would take them away from me. Through the ruins of the city led large and small groups of prisoners. These groups merged into one large column, first of hundreds, then of thousands. We were passing by captured German positions. Hit and burned vehicles, tanks and guns of all kinds edged our road, trampled in the hard snow. Dead bodies lay everywhere, frozen to hardness, completely emaciated, unshaven, often twisted in agony. In some places the corpses lay piled in great heaps, as if the standing crowd had been cut down by automatic weapons. Other corpses were mutilated to the point of being unidentifiable. These former comrades had been run over by Russian tanks. Over the years of the war I had lost many comrades, seen death and suffering, but never had I seen so many fallen soldiers in one small place. I walked light. All I had left was an empty satchel, a trench coat, a blanket picked up along the way, a wok and a clipboard. I had a can of canned meat and a bag of breadcrumbs from the emergency stockpile. In the endless column of prisoners, many could only drag themselves forward. Only here did I realize how pathetic and exhausted the soldiers looked. I was still eating the fat I had gained on leave, and anyway, I had starved for 6 weeks less than the others. And as an artilleryman, I was in better conditions than the infantry on the steppe in the open air. Now I saw all around me figures half dead from hunger, who had hardly the strength to walk. More and more soldiers, exhausted by the march, lagged behind and fell. The few Russian convoy gradually ceased to shout the bistro and divide with which they had driven us before. They themselves shaved dejectedly in the snow. In the tail, the completely exhausted prisoners began to fall. At first they were carried by their comrades, but soon the stronger ones became so weak that they could not carry such a burden. Those who remained alone lagged behind, fell and remained in the snow. The frost spared them from this ordeal. With fists and rifle butts the Russians briefly lifted the fallen, and then the first shots rang out. Then a shout ran through the column of prisoners. There were loud protests, cursing, and demands that we stop so we could take a break. This was followed by blows, brutal attempts to get us to move, and shooting over our heads. The human will to live forced the weak to drive themselves blindly to avoid being shot by the guards. More frequent gunshots and more infrequent cries of protest showed how dumbed down from fatigue this mass was. Everyone focused on themselves and continued to walk tiredly forward step by step. I was outraged and distressed that the escorts were shooting helpless fallen soldiers and leaving them lying there. What else could they do? Anyone who fainted and fell would soon freeze to death anyway. There was no transportation. The Russians themselves had transportation problems during their westward offensive, and their leadership gave little thought to the masses of prisoners marching from the front line. During our offensive in 41, we were not prepared for the huge number of Russian prisoners either. Did our convoys also shoot at the prisoners? I didn't know. I never dealt with Russian POWs. On the other hand, it was more humane to end the suffering with a bullet. Who knows what was going through the minds of the escorts, as they pointed rifle barrels at the helpless men writhing on the ground. Compassion for a soldier is a luxury rarely afforded in our ruthless profession. Since we were escorted by soldiers from frontline units, I did not have the feeling that we would be bullied, beaten, or systematically shot. These soldiers carried out orders without unnecessary emotion. Despite all rational explanations, the anger at the victors did not disappear. The Russians should have been able to prepare to receive the large number of prisoners taken at Stalingrad. They should have known that the prisoners were in desperately poor health. They especially should have made arrangements for the wounded filling the city cellars, rather than leaving them to fend for themselves, losing their battle with death. Clearly, despite methodical calls to surrender, no one had thought of that. The only thing that meant anything to them was the collapse of the fascist German Sixth Army. Toward them came convoys of trucks, all with their headlights on, almost like peacetime. Russian T-34s stood as formidable shadows along the sides of the icy road. Small fires under their bellies kept their engines warm, ready to move. The Russians clearly understood what frost was and how to deal with it. We were finally driven into a large ravine, already full of men. We stood and froze, waiting to see what would happen next. As always in uncertain situations, there were rumors going around that food would be distributed, or that the sick and wounded would be loaded onto trucks, or that we would be sent to the Don River, where we would be loaded onto a train. There was a lot of speculation, but nothing happened. The Russian sentries were walking along the crest of the gully. They were freezing, too. There was a lot of noise, but there was no food, not even water. Many sucked snow, but it was risky. The column went through the snow all day. From time to time I heard the now familiar gunshots at the tail of the column. The next night also passed in snow, and the next day we continued on an empty stomach. As we walked through a hamlet of ramshackle huts stretched along the road, we met with the hospitality of the locals. We were insulted in an unintelligible language. Many wanted to spit on us, but didn't dare get close enough. It was a parade of pathetic ruins. No one looking at us could imagine that only a few weeks ago we were a powerful army that inspired terror in the Russians. The column marched northward to the prisoner of war camp at Frolov. There I met some of my soldiers again, including non-commissioned officer Fritz. But he was a pitiful sight. He was lying on the ground in a heap of his own feces. Hunger and disease were rampant among the soldiers and had already killed many. With the arrival of spring, conditions in the camp did not change much. On the Soviet holiday of May Day there was even an additional distribution of bread. Soon afterward, the officers were separated and put on a train heading north. After a long journey with frequent stops to let military echelons pass, the prisoners were unloaded and put on a ship on the Volga. A few days later they reached their new home, Yelabuga. The newcomers from Frolov were lucky in one respect. The typhus epidemic that had swept through Yelabuga and claimed hundreds of lives had ended shortly before their arrival. I was in Soviet captivity for almost 7 more years. I was transferred to different camps and sent to work on the reconstruction of several facilities. My first hopes for repatriation ended in disappointment, but in December 1949 I was finally released. And on New Year's Eve I arrived home, having completed the 7-year school of life. As a political officer in the camp once said,